US allows Ukraine to use air defense to destroy aircraft and missiles over Russia. The United States does not place restrictions on Ukraine's use of US-supplied air defense systems to eliminate Russian missiles or fighter jets over Russian territory if they pose a threat to Ukraine. According to the Washington Post, the agency cites a statement by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken at a press conference in Chisinau, who said that the United States not encourage or enable strikes outside of Ukraine. But Ukraine, as I've said before, has to make its own decisions about the best way to effectively defend itself. Blinken adds that the United States has adapted and adjusted to the changing conditions on the battlefield, and that as Russia uses new tactics of aggression and escalation, he assured that Washington will continue to do so. According to the newspaper, about 3 weeks ago, shortly after Russia launched its offensive on Kharkiv, Ukraine asked the United States to ease long-standing restrictions on the use of US-supplied weapons to strike targets inside Russia. Some senior officials support such a move, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who urged President Biden to agree to lift the restrictions. According to the agency, the White House is considering such a proposal, but no action has been taken yet. Washington is facing pressure from NATO and several key European allies to allow Ukraine to use the full force and range of US-provided weapons. In May, the discussion about the prohibition of Western countries to use weapons supplied to Ukraine on the territory of Russia intensified. About 10 countries have authorized strikes, while the United States and Germany have refrained from making official statements. According to Political 2, senior officials in the administration of US President Joe Biden have allowed Ukraine to use American weapons to strike Russian territory. However, Washington has not yet made a final decision, and the matter is still under consideration. It is noted that representatives of the White House and Biden's top aides are signaling readiness to allow Ukraine to strike Russia with US weapons. This comes amid pressure from some European allies and Ukrainian officials who are calling for the lifting of restrictions on such a step in the context of the Russian advance in the Kharkiv region. It is noted that Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke about possible changes regarding the relevant taboo during his visit to Moldova under pressure from journalists. US President Biden is considering tough new countermeasures to stop Russia. Russia's achievements on the Ukraine front are forcing the White House to reconsider some of its so-called red lines. To counter Russia's offensive in Ukraine, US President Joe Biden is considering new tough countermeasures, columnist David Ignatz writes in his column for the Washington Post. The point is to punish China for supplying key technologies to Moscow and to lift restrictions on Ukraine's use of American short-range weapons to attack Russian territory. These steps would represent a significant escalation of Biden's carefully calibrated policy of supporting Ukraine to avoid direct confrontation with Putin or his key ally Xi Jinping. The fact that such steps are now being considered shows the administration's growing concern about Ukraine's vulnerability on the battlefield, noted the author. It is pointed out that the threat of new sanctions against China is especially sensitive since it arises at a time when both countries are trying to stabilize their relations. But US officials are concerned that Beijing, while formally honoring its promise not to supply weapons to Moscow, has become a major enabler of the Russian defense sector and its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It is noted that China is the largest supplier to Russia of 50 high-priority, dual-use goods, and also supplies about 70% of Russian imports of machine tools and 90% of imported microelectronics. In addition, China is providing Russia with satellite technology that could be critical for communications and targeting in strikes against Ukraine. The columnist adds that US officials are equally concerned that Russia is massing troops and equipment on the border to attack Kharkiv and other cities in eastern Ukraine. American artillery and short-range missiles could hit these targets without threatening deep strikes on Russia. But for now, the United States is limiting their use inside Ukraine, so it cannot strike large Russian logistics and troop assembly centers directly abroad. But that could change as other NATO countries put pressure on Biden to loosen controls. The author suggests that we may be approaching another turning point in Ukraine as China increasingly leans toward a partnership with the newly dominant Russia. Biden is weighing whether to deepen his alliance with Kiev. That would bring new risks, but it would make sense if it could bolster a shaky Ukraine and restore balance at the negotiating table, at which this war must ultimately be settled. Trump would bomb Moscow. If Russia attacked Ukraine during his presidency, U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump said he would bomb Moscow if its invasion of Ukraine began during his presidency. He said this during the election campaign. At a private event, writes the Washington Post publication's anonymous interlocutors noted that Trump suggested that if he were the president of the United States, he would bomb Moscow and Beijing if the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine or China attacked Taiwan. The remark surprised some of his campaign donors, journalists, and that in general, during pre-election events, Trump talks about foreign policy and the topics he discusses at rallies, namely inflation and immigration, as Joe Biden supporters in Hollywood and Silicon Valley refrain from supporting Biden's disastrous campaign. Donors across the country are maximizing their efforts to re-elect President Trump, as they realize we cannot afford for more years of Joe Biden's terrible policies. Trump spokeswoman Carolyn Leavitt said in a statement, Trump was recently booed and ridiculed during the Libertarian National Convention. In particular, during the speech of the presidential candidate, people in the crowd shouted bullshit and other offensive language. According to some experts, Trump's second presidency could tear apart Europe. The return of the former president would cement changes in the United States that can no longer be ignored. Politico wrote, as the presumptive Republican presidential nominee, Trump has barely mentioned Ukraine or articulated any policy positions regarding the country or Russia's war against it. With less than 6 months away from the presidential election, Trump's vague past remarks on foreign policy, his public admiration for Russian President Vladimir Putin, and the varied views within and outside the GOP are shaping the discourse in his absence. Despite posting frequently on his social media network, Truth Social, he has mentioned Ukraine only a few times in recent months. We should never give money anymore without the hope of a payback or without strings attached. One of Trump's Truth Social posts read in February. Another from April said, as everyone agrees, Ukrainian survival and strength should be much more important to Europe than to us, but it is also important to us get moving Europe. At the same time, Der Spiegel journalists reported that Biden may refuse a second term in favor of Michelle Obama. It is known that the Democratic Party even included Michelle Obama in its public opinion polls regarding potential candidates.